Well, hello, I'm Stuart. Welcome to the first edition of Inside the Signal with Sigma 360, where we unpack the sanctions, financial crime, and compliance stories that actually change how risk teams work. We're kicking off with a big one today, Cuba, and the most aggressive sanctions orders Washington has issued on the island in years. I'm really excited to be joined today by Claire O'Neill McCleskey. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
You have a very distinguished background, having served in OFAC, having served in FinCEN as our financial attaché in Mexico. I believe you faced off with the Russians.
Yeah.
And now you lead Clarity Consulting. Welcome to the show.
You.
I'd love to hear a little more about your background and a little bit more about Clarity and what you guys are focused on.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Always delighted to talk about Cuba. So, yeah, my career, I actually started in investigative journalism at Insight Crime, which is a great resource for reporting on organized crime in DC and Medellin, Colombia, and then joined Treasury, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, working in what used to be the Office of Special Measures, so doing Section 311. Was the attaché in Mexico City for a year before leaving government for a while to go to HSBC and London, do complex money laundering investigations. Came back to the U.S., rejoined Treasury, joined OFAC, and as you alluded to, started an OFAC policy working on the Russia sanctions program and the oil price cap before taking over the compliance division, which does OFAC's public-private engagement, the hotline, all the guidance for industry.
All the fun stuff.
Yeah, it was a great way to learn about the really practical side of sanctions implementation and hear from businesses, not just in the U.S., but around the world about the challenges they're facing in implementing U.S. sanctions.
What's an example of something difficult that you might get a phone call about?
Well, the classic OFAC Friday night phone call was that a vessel was on fire or had been hit by something or was sinking, and you need to get a tug out there, you need to get a salvage, you need to write a license. Those get really, really complicated, but the team that's still at OFAC is amazing at jumping on that quickly. But there are some situations like that, when I joined OFAC, I came very much from the financial services world.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you don't have emergencies in banking, you do, but to go to the world of maritime shipping, oil and gas, energy assets, where sometimes things were literally life and death, right? If something had gone wrong, and OFAC needed to act really, really quickly.
That's so interesting. And what about Clarity? So you've shifted from all of that into Clarity. What sorts of clients are you working with, and are they facing similar challenges to the ones that you advised on when you were at OFAC?
Yeah, so I started Clarity along with Claire Grunwald, my business partner, who was the maritime shipping and energy lead at OFAC compliance, really because we saw a bit of a niche in the market for very practical consulting assistance, particularly for companies that aren't in financial services, right? If you're a bank at this point, your sanctions program is likely to be very mature. Mm-hmm. Not that you can't add things or find efficiencies or better tools, absolutely, or that you don't have big problems. But companies in shipping, insurance, energy, metals and mining really are dealing with unique issues, and how they implement sanctions is really different than what a bank's going to do.
Right.
And so, if you come in and you try to say, this is what your program is going to look like, and it's based on that FFIC manual for banks here, this just doesn't work when you're a ship owner or a charterer or a shipbroker.
And do most of them have programs at this point, do you think? Or or maybe their idea of a program is not what you would expect a program should look like?
I think it's really different country by country and industry by industry. And a lot of it, I think, depends on your relationship with your bank, for example. Yeah. If you've had any kind of media exposure, just your familiarity, a lot of places still, which can work for companies. They'll run it out of their legal department. They'll run it the same way they run export controls or other types of compliance. They don't have a dedicated, person. And a lot of them, I think smartly, they rely on external legal counsel. They do rely on outside parties just because it doesn't make sense when you're a ship owner, you have 6 tankers. You're not going to have a 10-person compliance team.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and luckily you're out there to help. Claire and Claire, Clarity
Yes.
Consulting.
Yeah, I know.
Is that where that emanated from?
Actually, credit to Peter Scharf from New York Maritime, who was like, you have to name the business Clarity. And we were like, Peter, we can't do that. That seems very silly, but it's worked at everyone. The number of people that will say, have you guys ever realized that it's your names? And we're like, oh my God, that's amazing.
Well, if there was ever an industry that needs clarity, it's this one. So,
Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for your service prior and what you do today. I want to ask you just, before we get into Cuba, just to maybe reflect a little bit on OFAC and some of the changes maybe that you're seeing, both in terms of sanctions, sanction packages, as well as enforcement trends, and just maybe the way it's working. Has anything changed since you've left? Is it similar to the way that it was? Are you seeing anything there?
I think a lot of things have changed, since the second Trump administration started in January of last year. On the policy side, on the sanction side, obviously you have huge change in policy priorities with moving away from Russia. We went through a period of multiple years of weekly rollouts, sometimes twice weekly rollouts, hundreds of targets, constant pressure on Russia. That's obviously stopped. There was only one Russia rollout last year. Same time, you had a switch to a focus on cartels, this focus on Cuba, which we'll get into, which has largely come out of the State Department, but been implemented by OFAC.
Right.
And then, of course, the back and forth about what's our posture on Iran, maximum pressure, then a ceasefire, then economic fury. We're back to economic fury again.
Absolutely.
On the enforcement side, though, on the civil enforcement side, they have really kept up the pace of civil enforcement actions and penalties. And, one thing that they even called out in one of their actions from earlier this year was don't try to read the policy tea leaves from an enforcement perspective, from a compliance perspective, follow the law.
Yeah.
They had an action where someone seemed to think, well, Syria policies changed, so I don't need to comply anymore.
I'm good to go.
Yeah, which is, of course, not the case.
I saw that the EU is readying a 1,600 name sanction rollout. That seems heavy.
Yeah, very, very heavy. I mean, the EU has really kept up the pressure on Russia. I think, one of the things that's been really challenging for companies, especially that operate in multiple jurisdictions, is the EU has also continued to roll out really complex sanctions prohibitions too, not just like you're on the list and your property's blocked and you can't do business with you, but, rules about oil origin and blending and natural gas. And so it's gotten really, really complicated to comply. Yeah,
I wouldn't want to be a bank trying to sort through 1,600 names that might drop overnight. Yeah. So something to keep an eye on. Before shifting to Cuba, I have to ask you, given your experience in Mexico and what is obviously an escalation by the Trump administration against drug cartels, what are you seeing there? And what do you have any thoughts, given that experience, having been forward deployed, on what that threat looks like, maybe how the U.S. government might be looking at it differently now that cartels are terrorist organizations, and any advice, from a Clarity Consulting perspective or just in general on how corporations and organizations maybe should navigate this?
I think from what I hear from companies operating in Mexico and from clients is that it really has gotten even more challenging since I was there 10 years ago. And part of what makes it so difficult with the new designation of the cartels as terrorist groups is the number one thing that Mexican companies or companies with subsidiaries in Mexico will say to me is, how will I know if someone is a member of a designated cartel? How would I know that, right? Because it's going to say
Sinaloa Cartel in the transaction, right?
They're going to wear a name tag. Yeah, their Venmo. If somebody's extorting my employees, if someone's holding up my trucks, if somebody is stealing my fuel, if somebody is, threatening my business or something like that, how do I know what group they're in, right? And I think people are so concerned. At the same time, Mexico is a difficult environment. There can be corruption. There can be, to use a phrase from 2016, fake news. So we have companies sometimes saying, I got this allegation. It's in this paper saying this person's corrupt. I've got this other, allegation that actually that's a fake allegation, by their political enemies. So think companies in Mexico deal with a lot of noise, and they're trying to turn that into, information they can make a decision off of, which is really hard because it's often not black and white, right? It's exiting a customer or winding down a contract with someone that you think might be involved in criminal activity, but you don't know.
Sure.
That person's not going to like that. They might react negatively to that.
Right.
What do you do then?
That's right.
I think it's gotten even more challenging. And I think companies are more afraid now to go to the U.S. government and just say, this is what we're seeing because of the material support, criminal liability with the new terrorism.
And it's not just Mexico, right? It's Colombia, it's potentially DR, it's
Venezuela, Haiti.
It's all over. Definitely food for thought with regards to Mexico cartels. Thank you very much, Claire. Let's shift to Cuba. So on May 1st, 2026, President Trump signs Executive Order 14404, layering new sanctions on top of the 60-year-old Cuban embargo in January 2026's EO 14380. What did that mean? And why?
So this is a big change for the Cuba program. I think the why is very apparent from, Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's given a lot of speeches, a lot of public statements about, very strong policy objectives in Cuba that he and the State Department have. The big change is for the entirety of the Cuba program, this was something that U.S. persons had to worry about, right? And foreign companies, to the extent you were involving a U.S. subsidiary or a U.S. affiliate or something like that, or sending something through the United States, right? So you or I,
or U.S. goods and services.
Yes, exactly. U.S. origin goods, U.S. origin services. If you or I had a business, if we, were a bank, if we wanted to deal with Cuba as Americans, that was prohibited.
Right.
But if you were a Spanish tourism company, or you were a European insurer or a cruise company, or, food exporter, anything like that, you could deal with Cuba. You could go to Cuba. You could have business relationships in Cuba. There was really nobody off limits beyond some limited, the Biden administration did do some global Magnitsky sanctions for certain people in Cuba. But really, if you were a non-U.S. company, you got used to, okay, all I need to do is I need to find any U.S. exposure, U.S. persons, and get rid of that. Other than that, you didn't need to make a risk assessment about doing business with Cuba from a sanctions perspective. This really changes that. So this is now an IEPA-based program. So that means A, the civil penalties are higher, and then B, it restructures the program to allow the U.S. to designate anyone operating in certain sectors of the Cuban economy, including energy, defense and related materiel, financial services, metals and mining.
Wow.
It's very broad. Allows for the designation of, Cuban state-owned entities or Cuban officials. One really big one, which is quite unique, is it also allows the blocking of anyone that owns someone else that's blocked on this program. So it kind of flips the usual we think about with the 50% rule. So if you're someone that owns some, Cuban SDN, you can also be blocked.
Wow, that's expansive.
Yeah, it's very expansive, and it's really, I think already you've seen media reporting about certain foreign companies, pulling out of projects in Cuba or, reevaluating their relationship, because now there's a very real risk that the U.S. could go after you.
So they could go after you directly, or they could, if you were a financial institution and you were a foreign financial institution and process something on behalf of someone, they could go after that as well?
Both. Yes, that's right. So you could be targeted for providing material to support to someone that was sanctioned under this program. Or, as you allude to, there are secondary sanctions, meaning if you're a foreign financial institution, you process a significant transaction involving anyone blocked under this program, you can be subject to certain sanctions. The thing that they sort of ported over from the amendments that the Biden administration did to 14024, the Russia EO, is they removed the knowingly standard. So used to be, for secondary sanctions, a transaction had to meet two thresholds, had to be knowing, had to be significant.
Okay.
Now, under this program, they've taken away knowing, which is a much higher threshold for banks to worry about.
Yeah, I wonder about enforcement after this, because one of the things I read recently is the majority of the world, at least through the UN, has voted to lift embargoes on Cuba. And I think except for Paraguay, Ukraine, and Argentina. So there are probably a lot of countries that find themselves maybe more aligned with Cuba, companies that operate in those countries more aligned with Cuba, that may or may not be paying attention to these changes. So there's a lot of education needed from the compliance teams around what these nuances mean, I would think.
It's really challenging. I think, a lot of countries have blocking statutes that prohibit their companies from complying with the Cuba sanctions. So the EU has one,
right?
Canada has one. They haven't really used them aggressively. They haven't gone after companies and said, you're complying with the Cuba sanctions, right? But to your point, I think no matter what a foreign company decides about how they're going to manage that risk, they do need to know in a way that they didn't need to know before, right?
Yeah.
Are you dealing with, there's a company called GAESA that the State Department is very focused on that allegedly controls 80% of the Cuban economy. This is a continued target of the State Department. You need to know if you're dealing with a GAESA affiliate or subsidiary or entity, so you can at least understand, I am engaging in business that might result in a subpoena, a designation,
right,
an enforcement action, right? Because that needs to be taken into account, even just commercially.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. I was reading about GAESA, like it's a military conglomerate of sorts, and I wonder so if this is happening and Cuba is an island, who is working with them at this point? I think before Venezuela would ship oil directly to Cuba to try to get around some of the embargoes that they had. There are strategic relationships and alliances, I believe, between Cuba and Russia that we know about. But how with all of these restrictions and something as extraordinary as what you just described, does a GAESA continue to operate, and does Cuba continue to go on? I would think that their economy must be under tremendous pressure at this point.
Cuba's in a very, very bad state. Yeah. And the Cuban people are really, really suffering. There's not enough food. There's not enough fuel. There's been rolling blackouts. There's not enough medical care. Absolutely, the economy is buckling. Now, that being said, it's obviously a population that is accustomed to a great amount of suffering. And so the, Cuban government clearly feels that they can maintain at least a sort of survival posture for some time. I think you can see in what's happening with Iran, it seems to be the Trump administration's posture is that they're kind of hoping the Cuban government will come to the negotiating table with some proposal for a future for their government. But, they've held out for a really long time. We'll see if they can continue to hold out.
Is there anything sort of in particular that you've seen with Cuba beyond these conglomerates, either on just something that companies should be looking out for specifically, or is there anything from an invasion of sanctions and an evasion of this embargo that people should look out for that they might inadvertently get caught up in?
I think you really said it earlier about sort of awareness and education for foreign companies. Because what I keep hearing is there are, everyone from ship owners to tourism companies, mining companies, right? People that are outside the United States and they just didn't have it on their sort of no-go zone before, right? And so they weren't really thinking, if we see something that's Cuban or there's a loss that happens in Cuba, a claim, whatever it may be, a business opportunity, that needs to get flagged up immediately the way that Iran would, right? Because I think people have in their mind, okay, even if my country doesn't have an issue with Iran, that's really high risk. I need to not touch that. And I think people are just...
Or North Korea or Russia.
Right, exactly, yeah. And, Cuba now, the Trump administration has put Cuba on that same sort of level.
That same level. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I guess just in terms of advice for firms, what I'm a corporate. I'm operating in LATAM. I might have crossed paths with Cuba in the past. I might be looking at that region again. Like, what sort of advice are you giving firms with exposure to higher risk jurisdictions in terms of consulting services, technology, data? How should firms be looking at how they navigate what seems to be an increasingly risk-on landscape that they have to navigate?
There's a couple things I think that, we're helping people do to manage risk. It's very kind of cliched at a basic level, just training for staff at all levels, having the right sanctions training, making sure that people know that this is an issue and they need to escalate. And then related to that, this is like the most boring basic thing. And sometimes I can tell people their eyes glaze over, but just like having escalation procedures and an internal mechanism that you don't need to have 20 investigators, right? That might not make sense for your company, but having a process by which your frontline employees can quickly get something up to your compliance team or your general counsel or whoever that person is, right? And say, something is off.
Yeah.
I've seen something weird. This is a red flag. I need somebody to look at that. That is the thing that we have seen people really get into trouble, is that the senior management that has, very good intentions and thinks they're running a very compliant company, something happens. And then when we start doing the investigation, maybe there's an office or a subsidiary or a particular plant or refinery or whatever else that was doing something. They didn't know they were doing anything wrong, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they did, but, that there was like a big gap there. I think that the other thing, which I know you guys deal with too, is just there's so many tools out there. There's so much information. I think a lot of companies have this feeling that if I have information available to me,
right,
now I have to act on it. Right. Which is really hard. And it's one of the things OFAC calls out in enforcement actions all the time. Is like, you had this information.
Yeah.
You knew this sanctioned person was involved, or you knew this jurisdiction was involved, and you didn't do anything about it. I do think some companies think, I just don't want to know about it.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't think is the right answer. I think it's investing in how do you get the information? How do you use it? How do you escalate it? How do you make a decision based on it?
Maybe you can help a little bit shine a light on the last couple of conferences I've been to. FinCEN and OFAC have participated, and it's great to see their participation. And usually someone asks, what should we be doing? How could we do more? The last couple of conferences I've been to, these representatives have said using the list alone is probably not enough. It's something you should do. Technical compliance is expected and required, but you should go further. You should think about networks. You should think about obviously ownership and 50%. What do you think what are they saying when they say that?
I think that from OFAC and FinCEN's perspective, they see what the sort of best looks like, right? From companies.
From everyone in the world.
From everybody, right? Which is not the standard that everyone needs to be held to or wants to be held to, for sure.
Yep.
But right, if you're FinCEN, you're seeing, thousands upon thousands of just kind of regular SARs about one particular behavior or one particular person, but you're also seeing these really great complex investigative SARs where someone at a bank has said, okay, we took the information in the OFAC press release, and we took the information in this law enforcement request you gave us, and we took information from our commercial intelligence provider, and we put it all together.
Right.
And it really looks pretty sketchy to us, and we've sort of pieced this for you. We might not ever know what it is. It just looks suspicious, and we've sent it up. And so I think that, from the government's perspective, they want to see more of that. Now, what's tough, I think, for companies and financial institutions, obviously it's a lot of pressure right now to cut costs, especially with AI. There's, constant new priorities that you're having to shift to, especially when the policy is changing a lot. So it's hard to say, hey, I'm going to have this team just do Russia. sanctions evasion.
Yeah.
Okay, well now they don't care about that anymore. Now
Right.
it's Iran. Okay, we're going to have them do Cuba. When everything's a priority, nothing's a priority.
I understand that.
So I think that's the message that they send back to government a lot is like, could you, truly ask us, focus on these things and sort of drop some of the other stuff.
I remember when the priorities came out, there was some grumbling that the priorities were many.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a big push now though, from FinCEN, from the Fed, from I was at Treasury recently around effectiveness and how do we make industry more effective and how do we evaluate effectiveness. I'm not sure that's been well defined yet, what effectiveness means.
Yeah.
I think we kind of know it when we see it, but it needs to be a little bit better defined, I think, for people to know where to invest and where to spend their time.
Yes. And you have to let something go, right? That's the flip side. You have to. And I think that's always what
is hard.
Where, regulators are reluctant to do is say, don't do that other thing.
Claire, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for walking us through your background and what you're seeing as a former official, what you're doing at Clarity, adding clarity to what's happening in Cuba. If there were two things maybe you want to leave folks with that you've seen in your career or you're seeing currently, advising folks to just be very serious about and pay attention to now, what would be just a couple of things high level? And you may have already mentioned some of them, but let's double click on that.
I think that, as we talked about, this has been an incredibly volatile period.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, companies are being asked to do two things at once, right? Which is stay on top of what is hot today or what has changed today, right? If the Strait of Hormuz is open or closed, and then also think about the 10-year OFAC enforcement timeline, right? They have 10 years to bring an enforcement case. And so, I think that's really hard to manage both of those things when you're getting questions from senior leadership who are reading the, FT every day and saying, what's going on with this? What's going on with this? What's going on with this? Oh, they don't care about that anymore. So why don't we go into Venezuela or Syria or whatever, right? And then on the compliance side, thinking, okay, I need to document everything. I need to have the processes. I need to have the information. I need to have the procedures so that if 8 years from now, I get a subpoena going, what were you doing in 2026 in Syria, in Venezuela, wherever, that you can say, and we're good. Right?
That's right.
We're good. We were good with the policy then, and we're good with, the
we have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really hard. That's like very easy to say.
Yeah.
But it's important.
Well, I think that's great advice. You heard it here first. Thank you for joining us for Inside the Signal. We are looking at a increasing risk landscape, one that companies must take seriously, including Cuba. And a number of other hotspots around the world. Claire, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.